Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over maps in JavaScript. Maps are a different data structure from the ones that we've seen so far, namely arrays and objects. In fact, maps are kind of often confused with objects. I really wanted to make this video along with the future videos on a similar object called sets because I noticed that a lot of the time it kind of gets glossed over and skipped, but it really is a super important and fundamental data structure, so much so that it pops up all the time in things like interviews, as well as when you're coding a lot of things on the back end and the front end when you're trying to optimize your code. So that said, let's just get right into it and take a look at what maps are all about. Okay, so to start for this one, I'd like to actually start using Google, and I want to kind of Google for what this map thing even is in the first place. So go ahead and kind of pull up your browser, and we're going to look for JavaScript map. Now, in a previous video, we looked at array mapping, which is actually a totally different idea from using the map data structure in JavaScript. So if you scroll down your Google search result list, you'll probably see the one that we looked at previously, which is this one right here, which is array.prototype.map, which allowed us to kind of go through each element in an array and apply some function to that element and put it in a new array. However, map, which is this one right here, is a totally different idea and concept. So I'm just going to pull up the documentation for map JavaScript, which is different from the array.prototype.map. So once that pulls up, I'm just going to read through this, and we're going to look at the most important parts of this, and we're going to actually code it out together. So a map apparently is an object. Many things in JavaScript are an object, funnily enough, that holds key value pairs and remembers the original insertion order of the keys. Okay, so that's interesting, right? Because a key value pair, that awfully sounds like properties in objects, right? We have a key and we got a value, so what's the difference? And in this case, at any value, both objects and primitive values may be used as either a key or a value. So here's the thing, with maps, we can actually use any value for the key. I mentioned before in the objects videos that we can only use strings and technically something called a symbol, which we won't get into until we get to the advanced videos, for the keys in an object. So even if you put like the number 1 as a key, it'll get turned into the string 1, for example, in an object. With map, that's not true. You can actually use anything as the key, including really funky things like objects and arrays. Now, I don't suggest you do this, especially at the start when you're learning this data structure. I'm going to stick to strings as the keys and treat it the exact same way as an object. Okay? So we're going to think of it as it has properties, which are keys and values, and we're going to just kind of do things with it just like we would with an object for the most part, but we're going to do it the mappy way instead. And towards the end of the video, I'll get into details as to why we would even want something that's so close to an object, just so it makes a bit more sense. But as a little bit of a teaser for that, if you scroll down a bit, for these documentations, I highly encourage you to kind of give these a quick read through just to get some experience with reading through documentation and have it be less intimidating. But you can see things here about kind of how the keys and values work and how you can loop through them. We're actually going to look at for-of loops, which is a new type of loop, in a separate video soon after this. It goes into some really fancy computer science stuff, which we'll get into in future videos as well, about time complexity and space complexity and things like that. But most importantly, there's another section down here called objects versus maps, which kind of is that niggling feeling in the back of our mind. It's like, how is this thing different from an object? So this is a nice table here, kind of explains the main differences. There's a whole bunch of differences. As I mentioned, the key types one is one of the differences. There's a bunch of things in objects that kind of make it quite complicated as a storage medium with all the keys and how an object prototypes work behind the scenes, which we'll also get into future videos since that's a bit more advanced. Maps keep the order of the keys. They have a size property, which we'll look at. And they have an iterable interface, which is also something we'll look at once we see the for-of loops. Performance arguably is slightly better. And then how they work with JSON, which is something I'll mention at the end of the video, is a bit actually more complicated. So I'd argue that that's a bit more of a con than an object. Okay, so a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. So let's actually kind of get to the code and take a look at how this thing works. For the code, we're going to look at the main methods that we would really use with a map, and we'll save the ones that need a for of loop for that video once we get to that, and we'll also look at size together. So I highly encourage you to look through these as we actually look at these methods together on the map, just so you can get a bit more information. Okay, so that said, I'm going to pull up Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this map-intro.js. So let's just create one of these and see how it even works in the first place. So I'm going to call this let's call this my map, and I'm going to do it equals to. And a map is a special type of structure in JavaScript. So there's no kind of built-in syntax like square brackets like this or curly brackets like this for an object. We actually have to do this thing called the new keyword and then map with a capital M like this with brackets after it. So this is extremely strange the first few times you see it. I'm not going to get into the crazy details behind how this works, because we're going to save that for an entire series of videos on this idea of classes and kind of object hierarchies and prototypes and things like that. But the way to think about this is we always have to use this new keyword when we're using this map type as well as a set type in the next videos. And we are using kind of this map, what's called the constructor. And you can think of it like a function, and we're calling this map objects function, which is going to give us back this map data structure to us. And we have to use this new keyword for reasons kind of beyond the scope of this particular video. So what we're going to get is if we do this new map, and don't forget the capital M with brackets, and we're calling it, we will actually get back a map thing. Map thing, as I say. So I'm just going to console log out this map thing, and we're going to take a look at what that actually is. So before we even kind of get into what this map object does and how it works, it's always fun to see what this logs out as. So I'm going to do node map intro, and wow, okay, well, I get map and then 0, not sure what that is, and I get like an object. Okay, well, that was anticlimactic, right? So what is happening here? This you can think of as an empty object. We've created a map that's empty. It has no key value pairs, very similar to in JavaScript. If we literally did this for a new object, it just has no properties or key value pairs inside of it as well. So how do we add things to a map? For an object, you remember that we did something like this. We did like object dot and then the key and then equals some value, right? We can't do that with a map. Maps are a bit more strict, but in a good way. They have these things called methods on them, very similar to how console.log is a method on the console object. We do, in this case, I called it mymap.something to set the keys or get the keys values and things like that. So let's see how this works. Let's say I want to add a new key value pair into this map. I would do something like this. I would say mymap.set, and this is going to take two arguments. The first argument is the key that we want to set, and then the second argument is the value we want to set for that key. So for example, if I want to set the key of name to the string natter, just like this, I would do this. I'm saying set the key name to the value natter. Okay, so now if I console.log out my map, let's see what we get. All right, interesting. So Node.js tries to be helpful and gives us some nice kind of syntax for this map with this nice little arrow thing, a little bit different than what objects look like. And it kind of does this thing here where it looks like it's maybe counting how many things we're adding. Kind of interesting. Let's try another one. I'll do right below this, before the console log, I'll do mymap.set. Maybe I'll do age. And then I'll say maybe I'm 10 years old, for example, and I'll run this again, and look at that, kind of got updated. That's pretty cool, right? So we it looks like it's keeping track of how many things we're adding here somehow. We'll see how to get access to that number later, just like an array has a length. And it has a key of name, which is pointing to the string natter, and another key value pair here, age, which is pointing to 10. Okay, so that's pretty cool. This is pretty much the same as an object, but there are some differences. And if we want to get the values out, we'll again see some more of these differences, right? So with an object, when we're trying to set a key to be a value, we just did the square brackets notation or the dot, and we could kind of set something to be something or change a value. With a map, we use set, and then to get a value back out, we have to kind of use the opposite of set, which you can imagine probably is called dot, drum roll please, get, right? So I'll do dot get, and if you think about this, get really only needs to know the key that we're interested in, right? Because we're saying, hey, go and fetch whatever value is at the key so-and-so. So if I say get me the key, whatever's at the key name, it will give me the string natter. If I say get me whatever's at the key age, it will give me the number 10. Okay, so if I say, for example, get me age like this, and I'll say const age, I'll put this in an age variable and I'll log out that age. Let's see what we get. I'll clear this out and I'll run this again, and you can see that I actually got back the number 10 right here. So I went and asked the map to go and fetch the value at the age key, and its corresponding value for age is this number that we stored, which is 10. Very similar to an object. Okay, and just to keep this extra clear, the object version of this would look like this so far. Okay, it would look exactly like this. This is what the object version of our map would look like. Okay, so I'll comment that out for now. And let's say that we want to change the age, right? How would we do that? So it's the same thing. I would say my map.set, and I want to change age. And let's say now I've had my birthday and I'm now 11. And if I console.log out my map, now the age should be changed, right? And now I have my age of 11 right here, which was changed from the 10. And that's because I used the same key to wipe out the previous value and give it the new value. All right. So now, what are some other things that we can do with maps? We saw that with objects. We can check to see if a key exists inside of that object by using the in keyword. Maps have a very similar what's called an API or method to do this that kind of is just easier to read. So for example, I can console.log out this statement. My map dot has, and then I give it a key. In this case, I'm going to give it the key of name. So if I do this, I'm asking the question, does my map have the key name inside it? And that's either going to be true or it's going to be false. This will give us back a Boolean value. All right, so I'm going to try this out, run it, and you can see that I get true, right? If I duplicate this line and I try to ask for, say, last name, right? We never set a last name inside of our map, right? So if I do this, I'll get false, as you can see right here, right? So this takes a little bit of getting used to. This API definitely feels a little bit more cumbersome, right? Because we're doing this set, and then we're doing kind of, instead of using the equals, we're doing like this kind of thing where we're giving it 2 arguments, and then the get is just slightly different than just kind of using the square brackets or the dot notation. Definitely a little bit more typing, which I mentioned programmers really don't like to do. But I'll kind of get into the reasons as to why this is more helpful in a second for most cases. And this, I would argue, definitely reads very, very nicely, right? I think in English, if you would read these statements, does my map have this key? It just feels much nicer, and it's less clunky than the object version of the same thing. So finally, I want to show you one last thing that's pretty cool. We can actually get this size value right out of the map by actually accessing the size property on this map object. So if I do console.log and I say my map.size, just like this, and it doesn't need to be called because it's not a function, it is just a property, so it's just storing the number automatically, and it changes as we add and change or delete values, which I'll show you in a second, to this map. Okay, so I'm going to clear this out and I'm going to run this, and you can see that I get 2. which is this number that's being stored here helpfully as its printout as well. So the size of this map is 2 key value pairs. Okay. Now, I think I said finally, but finally we want to wrap this up by looking at delete. So we've added keys and values using set. We've gotten those keys and values back out using get. We've been able to check to see if it exists in the map using has. We can even see the size, but what's missing right now is the deletion. If we have something in here, how do we get it out or delete it? We use the delete keyword in objects to get rid of keys and their associated values or properties as a whole, and it's very, very similar with maps. So I can do this. I can do my map dot delete, and then I give it the key that I want to delete. So in this case, for example, let's say I want to delete the age key. If I console.log out my map after this, we'll see that the age key value pair is gone. And if I in fact console log out my map.size once more after this, we'll see that the size has been changed to 1. So you can see that these are the last 2 lines. When I run this code one more time, I've deleted the key value pair of age and 11 respectively, and I only have the key value pair of name, which is pointing to my name Natter, and then there's only 1 key value pair left inside this map, which is what the size property is pointing to. Okay, perfect. So this was definitely a shorter video because I wanted to really cover the API behind maps. There are other methods on maps, notably these ones here, for example, entries, which we saw with objects, keys, and then values. However, in order to use them, they actually work quite differently from how they work with objects. And kind of more efficiently as well. And in order to really take use of that, we have to learn this thing called the for of loop and some other things like iteration, which we'll get into in a couple of videos actually. But apart from that, that's pretty much how maps work. So that said, I promised I would mention why would we ever use this compared to objects, right? This syntax definitely looks easier, just feels easier, feels more JavaScript-like, right? Maps, as you look through that table, there's a lot of technical reasons behind the scenes as to why they're more efficient and safer to use for most purposes. As well, if you kind of translate this idea across programming languages in general, a lot of programming languages have this exact concept built into them. Some languages call them maps or dictionaries or hash maps or whatever they're called, but they follow a very, very similar kind of syntax, which means you have things like a set or a get or a has or a delete. And if you can learn it in JavaScript, that translates across to other languages really, really nicely. For just storing information in JavaScript, I would highly encourage you to use a map as it's much more verbose and easier to understand by just reading through it, and you're less likely to run into kind of edge cases, which are weird bugs and errors that might happen in cases where you use an object incorrectly. That said, I do also have to provide a con for map, which is that in certain cases it is slightly annoying to use. For example, there's this idea called JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, which we use a lot in like back-end web development and even in front-end web development at times, where we want to send back and forth these objects really that are kind of strings. And maps kind of have this kind of complexity because the keys can be anything. They can be numbers, they can be objects and arrays. It's hard to turn them into those strings kind of just really quickly, with like one line of code. That's not true of objects, since objects have either symbols or strings as their keys. They're very easy to turn into this JSON mode where we can send this stuff back and forth over the internet. So if that's the use case, it might make sense to use an object. However, you can definitely use a map for that as well if you know how to do that conversion, and there's many, many ways to do that efficiently as well. So which one to use, it really depends. I'm going to use maps where it makes sense to use, which is in most cases, and I'll definitely point out the kind of cases and projects that we do shortly where it might make slightly more sense or a bit easier or more ergonomic to actually use objects. So that said, the next video, what we're going to do is go through a bunch of exercises together on maps, we're going to actually follow the same exercises that we did with objects, but re-implement them on maps, just so you can kind of compare and contrast the differences between these two ideas, because they're so central to JavaScript, and knowing when to use one or the other is going to eventually get very important. Even if you just default to maps at the start, it's an important distinction to make and kind of comfortable jumping between the two. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. As well, I'd love to hear in the comments if you've maybe seen a map before, if you used it, if you like it compared to an object, or if you've seen some of the methods in there that you might feel are maybe more useful or more maybe even annoying to use than an object. I'd love to hear in the comments below. So that said, until the next video where we go through the exercises together. See you later.